Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. For those that are here for the first time, I introduce myself as Simon Jacobson, however you prefer, and as advertised, we are here to celebrate and honor a once in a 28-year event that takes place basically 2 or 3 times, 4 times in a person's lifetime. And that is, in the Jewish tradition, what we call Birchat HaChama, the blessing of the sun. And being something that rarely happens, meaning so many years, almost 3 decades. The last time it happened was in 1981. And is anyone old enough to remember that here? Very good. So, and the prior one before that was 1953. Anyone there? Anyone here? That no, okay. And before that, 1925. So there are people who remember the 1925 one as children. So it is possible. That would make somebody now 84 years old if they were born 1925. They have to be around 90 years old to remember it, I guess. And I just actually yesterday visited a friend, an elderly gentleman who was one of the Jewish men in the American Army, who actually was part of the liberation of the camps. And one of his hobbies is collecting old books and almanacs and calendars. So he showed me a collection that he made of material around the Birchat HaChama, about the blessing of the sun. And it was quite fascinating. He had documents in pretty good shape that went back over 200 years. Back to 1812, there was also one. And documents from different parts of the world, including Bombay, in different cities in Germany and in Europe, in Hungary and Poland and Morocco. So clearly, whenever it took place, it was a special event. But being in the early years, less of it was documented. Now we live in a world of technology, so today everything is documented. I guess in 28 years from now, there'll be a very powerful record of what transpired this year. But above all, what is the significance of this? And as always, the biggest challenge and question is the personal significance. Because it's nice to talk about, it's intriguing, a rare occurrence. So that's going to be the real focus of my discussion here. Why should we care? Why is it important to us? Why is it relevant? And especially being that it's right before Passover, which will be next Wednesday night. Next Wednesday, this year, another rare event that this blessing on the sun is made the day before Passover. That is only recorded in our history of 11 times. So that itself is unique. So clearly there's also a connection to the Passover season. Now, I discussed it somewhat a little last week, and then if you've seen my weekly essay, I wrote about it as well. But being that it'll literally be a week from now, and we will not have a class till then, this will be the last, I decided to tackle it, take the bull by the horns. So, with that being said, the first thing I think is critical to spell out what exactly is this event from a scientific and astronomical point of view. And when you really dig deeper, you'll see, as hopefully we'll see this evening, that there are really fascinating and profound implications around this whole cycle of the sun. And as we'll also discuss, of course, it links to the cycles of the moon. The sun and the moon are both these twin celestial bodies that influence this earth directly from the beginning of time. So the cycle of the moon is a good example to use simply for contrast because it's much easier to relate to. The cycle of the moon, everyone we see it with our eyes every month. The cycle of the moon goes through its birth, the birth of a new moon, which in the Hebrew calendar is the Rosh Chodesh, the new month. So last week was Rosh Chodesh. If you looked up in the sky, you probably didn't see anything, even if there were no clouds, because it was the birth of a new moon, which essentially means the angle of how the sun, the moon, and the earth are positioned are such that the reflection does not reach here. Think of the moon, let's say, as a mirror, so the reflection doesn't reach. The full moon, on the other hand, which will be the night of Passover, actually next Wednesday night, will be a full moon. A full moon is always the 15th day of the Hebrew month. The full moon is when that angle is a perfect right angle. So the sun is here, the moon is here, the earth is here, and in such a configuration where the moon reflects the entire moon's first surface of the moon reflects the sun. The first quarter of the moon, third quarter, and the various changes it goes through daily, every night, is basically that configuration shifts, and therefore the earth only sees part of the moonlight that is reflected from the sun. In other words, practically speaking, the moon is always a full moon, except not shining to earth. If you went out somewhere out of space, you'd be able to always see a full moon if you were in the right position. Then there's also a dark side of the moon. And it is true that the dark side is always dark and the light side is always light. But that's not so relevant to our discussion. The point is that there is a cycle here. And this cycle, not only in Judaism, but also in other religions and in schools of thought, have always mystified people. And many rituals and many different things have been established to, in a sense, honor these cycles. And these are not just some ancient cycles that today, because we have modern science and we understand them in a different way, are irrelevant. Many of them are extremely profound and have very direct impact on us. Because remember, even though the simple statement that the moon reflects the sun is much more complicated than that. Even though the moon is just a reflection of the sun, the moon has an impact on Earth that the sun doesn't have. For instance, the moon cycles affect the tides. As a matter of fact, if the moon didn't go through its cycles, we would not exist, because the tides of the oceans would not be monitored, and they could end up destroying the Earth. So the moon can affect the tides. In other words, a full moon has a stronger gravitational effect on Earth. So it's not just light, it also has certain rays that emanate. There are plants that grow to moonlight and not sunlight. And then in general, the moon, not just metaphorically and romantically, but also many other ways, creates a mood that the sun doesn't create. It's much more haunting, much more mystique. The moon in poetry is often much more referred to a feminine type of energy, with the sun being much more of a masculine type of energy, and many other implications, including the fact, I think I mentioned this, that you'll see two people who love each other. You never see them staring at the sun, but you'll see them staring at the moon. And not only because the sunlight is too strong and because of and glaring, but it just has a different impact. It's the night energy, the energy of the moon. So the moon has its cycle. By contrast, it can help understand the solar cycle as well. I'm not going into a in-depth discussion on astronomy. First of all, I'm not necessarily equipped to be the one that does that, but even the minimal that I do know is also something that can be too complicated here to get into the entire cycles of how the planets and the solar system function and work. But according to Jewish tradition and Jewish astronomy, the soul has its own cycle. I actually was talking to a scientist the other day. I wanted to see how it compares to the so-called contemporary or the modern day perspective in astronomy, and actually he said it actually fits very well, even though there are some discrepancies between the Jewish approach to the cycles of the earth and the moon and the sun. But as far as this goes, there is, we call the spring equinox, or called the vernal equinox. In other words, even though the sun seemingly does not go through the same cycle like the moon, because the sun doesn't change, like the moon is very obvious. There's a new moon, a full moon, a quarter moon, a three-quarter moon, etc. But nevertheless, the sun does have in its position to Earth, we know there are different positions. For instance, in the summer, the days are longer, the nights are shorter. That's regulated by the sun. not by the moon. But there are 2 times in the year where day and night are exactly equal. That's called the equinox. That's when the way the sun is situated and its angle to Earth, the sun is 12 hours sunlight and 12 hours night time. We're talking about at the equator. Of course, there are parts of the world where it could be 6 months dark, 6 months light. But we're talking about the equator. There is an area where you have almost equal amount. In a place like New York, it's not exactly the amount, but there are, I think just last March 21st, I believe, was the equinox. And that was the closest with day and night was almost the same length, perhaps with some variation. So there is a there's also a solar cycle. However, it's more subtle and not that obvious. Because, as I said, the moon is a daily occurrence. The sun, this only affects us, or at least it's only measurable, really, during these equinoxes. Then there are other cycles of the sun. But when you go more in depth into it, and this is definitely based on Jewish tradition, because according to Jewish tradition, according to the Bible, the sun and moon were created. They did not evolve over millions or billions of years. They were created. They were placed the way they are. And here's not the place, again, to discuss how one reconciles that with modern science. You know, we can have that discussion. I'm not avoiding it. But every discussion, as we all know, needs to begin with some axioms. And being that next Wednesday morning is the blessing of the sun, let's just suffice to say I'm going with the axiom according to the Jewish tradition. Those that need to address it more on a more scientific level, as I said, we can designate time for that as well. So with that being said, what is the Jewish perspective, or the Torah perspective? The Torah perspective is that 5,769 years ago, the sun and moon were planted in a particular location in the firmament, in the heavens. And just like everything goes through a birthday, which means just as each of our souls came down to earth and came out of we emerged from our mother's womb at a particular moment, a particular day. So in Jewish tradition, particularly mysticism, and this is a critical introduction to understand the significance of the blessing of the sun, time is a spiral. Time is not linear. In other words, when we say the river of time, which suggests that there's a past here, present here, the future there, from a mystical perspective, the Kabbalists explain that time is a spiral, a cycle. However, it's not a cycle like a wheel that just turns again and again on its own same orbit. It is a spiral, like think of it as a spring that returns to the same point every year that moment, which is why our birthdays are so significant and why we celebrate holidays and why we celebrate Shabbat. These are not just commemorative days that commemorate something that happened thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago, or tens of years ago. Your birthday, when your soul and body emerge on this earth, there's some type of energy that repeats itself every year at that point. That means your birthday essentially is almost a revisiting your point of origin, your point of departure. Like revisiting the mission for which you were sent here. And the same thing is with the holidays. When we will celebrate in a week from now, sitting at the Seder table, Passover, it's not just because the Jews left Egypt 3,321 years ago on that day, but because something happens. The same energy that flowed then will flow again in a week from now. And it doesn't flow tonight, which is why, like someone asked me, why can't they light a Shabbos candle Thursday night? It also brings light into the world. Yeah, there's no problem. You can light candles any night of the week and bring a lot of light into the world. However, to be able to make that sanctified blessing, that Sheker Deshanu, where we say that we draw down a special particular Shabbos light, it doesn't happen on Thursday night. That's not the time of that moment. That moment has other contributions. Friday night, at a certain point, that cycle repeats itself, which also explains why there are 7 days in the week and why we begin to count from day one. You know, why not continue day 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, etc.? Because something actually happens from the mystical perspective on Friday night, and then on Saturday when it ends, the cycle ends and it starts again. So every Sunday is like the original Sunday. Every Monday is like the original Monday. Which therefore means that when things occur, it's not because they occur, that's why it's a special day. It's because it's a special day, and that's why they occur then. There's an expression in the Talmud, Megalgalin Schus L'Yem Zakai, that when a day has particular energy that's conducive to something, certain things will happen on that day. which is why we're told that certain days are special blessed days, why we try to make weddings and other celebrations during certain periods of the month. Certain times of the year, certain things should be avoided. Not because it's a bad day or a good day. That doesn't exist in Jewish thought. There is no predestined good or evil. That's up to our choice. But there's definitely predispositions. Just like each of us is born with different personality types, it doesn't dictate what you're going to do. We have free will. However, that doesn't mean we don't have leanings. We all have tendencies, hereditary tendencies, other tendencies that we may pick up and assume through our childhood and through our lifetime. And the question is, what we're going to do, that is up to us. But there's no question that every moment in time has its particular personality, so to speak. So with that small introduction, we go back to the sun. So when something happens that was the same way it happened the first time, it has significance. What that significance is the point of our discussion here. You know, I've seen many websites, and I've seen many different discussions about the sun cycle. To be honest, which is why I'm discussing this in this context, I haven't seen, so many people have asked me, so who really cares? So I guess for people who grew up in a traditional home and environment and follow the letter of the law, so then you do it whether you understand it or not. But being that I happen to have been blessed to be exposed to many types of people, not only those that are mechanical Jews, the question has been posed to me, so who cares? I mean, it's very nice. Nothing wrong to go out and talk about the sun, especially in this green age of solar energy and stuff like that, and then focus on that. But what really is the meaning of it? And this is a small little footnote that I have to always make, because some of you may have been exposed, I'm sure have been exposed, some of you may have grown up in very traditional environments, where you may have run for your life because of the dogma, the closed-mindedness, the rigidity, the insulation that did not allow for one to really, let's put it, self-actualize. And then some of us may not have grown up in an environment like that, but when you meet people that come from that world, it's a big turnoff because you see that type of condescension, that type of almost judgment and all that comes with what so many of us associate with religion. So though I may look like one of those guys, I'm here to tell you that I'm not. Obviously, you'll have to learn this on your own. Just because I say I'm not doesn't mean I'm not. So we'll get to know each other. Maybe trust can be requested. It has to be earned. But let's put it this way. Being that I did grow up in a traditional environment, I do know the pitfalls and the traps of that well enough. And I myself was quite turned off by it, just for the record. However, I came to discover another dimension, which is what we talk about here, and that is the spiritual dimension. And that to me became the primary and the real driving force of why Judaism is Judaism. And that's the only reason why I believe it's here 4,000 years later. No way that it would have been held together just by a rigid set of dogmatic rules. If that was the case, then many other religions and other systems should have also survived, and you don't find that. It had to be there was a profound spirituality, and this is not my speculation. When I began to explore as a teenager and look into the books, and I saw what was documented, and remember, Jews did not leave things to hearsay. Every generation left us with thousands and thousands and thousands of books. You can't even imagine how large the Jewish libraries would be if all those manuscripts would be published. You're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of works that accumulated, because the Jews were the people of the book, and not just the Bible, but the commentaries on the Bible and the commentaries on the commentaries. I don't even know how many layers there are. There are probably like 30 layers of commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. And when you study it, not only, I'm not just talking the volume now, the number, but above all, as I said, there's a profound spiritual message that in some books is very overt, and some of them more subdued and more covert, but it's clearly there for anyone to see, and it's not fabricated. It's not some 21st century creation to make it like Buddhist. Like someone said to me, where do you get these spiritual ideas from? You must have read too much Buddhism. And I found that insulting. I said, well, I'll tell you this: the Buddhists have a thing called Brahman, and other references that all refer to Abraham. So, if anything, they may have gotten it from Abraham, not the other way around. The fact that most Jews don't know this, or the fact that the statistics show that 60% of Buddhists in America are Jewish, just as demonstrates how this is the best kept secret. So applying all that to the issue of the blessing of the sun, who cares? And there's nothing wrong with asking a sacrilegious question, not just about this, but about, frankly, any matter, whether it's sitting at a Passover table and all those traditions, or the obsession that some of our grandmothers had in searching for chametz, for the last crumbs of bread, or other seemingly trivial details that the Jews obsess over. Who really cares? And this includes literally every detail of the Torah. This is not only a legitimate question. It's actually a question that's a necessary question, which is why we insist our children ask questions at the Seder table. As I think I pointed out here, my whole life I've asked those questions, and my children ask the questions of me. And then just a few years ago, Passover, I was daydreaming or night dreaming, whatever you call it, as a Seder. And I realized that 2 of the questions of the 4 are never answered in the Haggadah. Throughout the whole night and throughout the entire text, which is a pretty long text, you'd think that he has 4 questions. And you encourage the children to ask these questions, you'd expect that they should at least attempt to answer them. So 2 of them are not even referred to altogether, besides in question form. You could probably guess which ones if you're familiar with these texts. So why we eat matzah is answered, of course. Why we eat moror, the bitter herbs, is answered. But the other 2 are why we dip and why we lean during the meal. Nowhere in the Haggadah is there reference made to it. I mean, somebody could answer it, but it's not stated anywhere in the Haggadah. So my question, the 5th question I had was, why would you ask 2 questions that you don't give an answer for? And then when you study the sources, you come to realize that one of those questions is actually, the answer for it is, in order to provoke the children to ask questions, that's why we do it. So that's a real conundrum, right? So the whole the question, why do we dip? We dip in order for provoke the children to ask questions. So here's what I came up with as my answer, which I applied to our discussion here, and that is that the greatest freedom of all, and Passover is freedom, is the power and the right to ask questions. In every totalitarian regime, and every closed-minded and insecure environment, and every ghetto, the first thing that they establish is called a Bureau of Truth and Information. As soon as a Bureau of Truth and Information has to be established, you can rest assured it's neither true nor information. Why do you need a bureau? Because you have to mind control, it's called. Control the newspapers, control the airwaves. This was what every dictator, everyone who wanted to have control, needed to control. Free information was not safe. Today, we're in a new world. It's not possible any longer. But for thousands of years, this was very possible. And not only possible, it was done. Jews, back almost over 3,000 years, instituted from the beginning when they left Egypt that freedom means, and we taught it to our children till this day, is the right, and not just the right, the absolute dignity to ask questions. So even if you don't always get the answer, but ask question, absolutely. And then they say, Shailas Chacham Chetzi Tshuva, which means the question of a wise person is half an answer. Once you already ask, and you have the courage to ask, you're already halfway there. Then it's a matter of discovery. Listen, sometimes you spend half your life just to find the right person to tell you what your question is. Forget about the answer. We don't always know what our question is. So, applying it back to the sun, who really cares? So as I said, to go a little deeper into the astronomical aspect of it is necessary to understand why we should care. So the first thing we care is because, as I said, it's like a birthday of the sun, and it's returning to its point of departure. What exactly happens, for those of you that really want to know the astronomy of it, it works like this. The sun is, traditionally, as I said, was created, placed in the heaven with the moon, Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, these 2 luminaries, Tuesday night, or Wednesday morning, you can say, Tuesday, Wednesday, the eve of Wednesday. In Jewish calendar, everything begins the night before. So Tuesday night, in other words, essentially you'd say that the moon probably was the one that first shined, because it was at night, and the sun rose that morning over the Garden of Eden. Now, Adam and Eve weren't there to see it yet. It would take 2 more days, but that's traditionally the sun and moon were placed, and they were placed in a particular position, which is the spring equinox. That's when it corresponds with. But here's the small caveat here. And this is what causes all the complications. The sun's cycle consists of, in other words, it returns to that point annually, like the spring equinox, but the spring equinox does not happen exactly 365 days later. The actual number for the sun's cycle is 365 and a quarter days. Actually, it's even more precise, like 365.24192, something like that. So bottom line is, if you go 365 days later, if the cycle was exactly 365 days, there wouldn't be an issue. The sun every year would celebrate its birthday, meaning would be exactly in the same spot at the same time, Wednesday morning, be in the same spot in the sky. However, because of that quarter, or almost a quarter, it's thrown off. So 1 year, it's not that significant. So it's thrown off from morning to night. Meaning the sun will return to the same spot, but not the same time. It'll be a quarter off, quarter of a day off. And then that accumulates day after day and year after year. At some point, the sun will continue to go through its cycle every year, but it will be at a different time. That spot will always be at a different time of year. According to the calculations, and these were made thousands of years ago, every 28 years, that quarter catches up with itself, so it returns back to that same point. It's similar to the idea of, like, your birthday. Let's say you were born on a Tuesday, right? The next year, your birthday is not going to be on a Tuesday. Maybe on another day. But every certain period of time, and by the way, 28 years is one of them, your birthday will come out the same day that you were born. The significance of it is not just a numbers game. Is because of what I said earlier, because there's an energy that's in every time and space. So the time and space of the sun's position and the time that it was placed there has very profound significance, which we shall discuss. And that's essentially what happens in the 28th year. Now it gets even more complicated than this, but I don't want to go into that because then we could spend here till next Wednesday morning talking about it. You can check it out on some of the websites. I think in the article I wrote last week, I included some links that go into more graphic detail, because the problem is it's not a quarter. See, if it was 365.25, 28 years would be one thing. Because it's not a quarter, over thousands of years, it's even more, the discrepancy is even more difficult to balance. So for this, if you want more information on this, I'll be happy. Just send me an email. I'll be happy to send you a link, an article, which you can study and break your head with. But for now, suffice it to say that based on the certain cycle that I'm describing here, it is the 28th. Every 28 years, there's definitely the sun returns to that place at the same time. Okay, now, what is the significance of that to us? And here we have to go into the sun and the moon and into a somewhat of a little mystical journey, if I may. And you'll stop me if I'm going too far, okay? We have to travel upward into the heavenly bodies. So the Bible, in its own cryptic way, says the following, that on Wednesday, Yom Revi, actually, the Bible does not call days by their name. It calls them by the number. There's day 1, there's day 2, there's the first day, there's day 2, there's day 3, day 4. So day 4, the Bible says, God created Shnei Ma'eris Hagdelim, 2 great luminaries. Ma'eris in Hebrew, Ma'er is a luminary, is a body that gives off light. But not just 2 bodies that give off light. Not just a body that gives off light, 2 great bodies that give off light. And HaKechavim, and the stars. In other words, though the stars, as we know, also give off great light, and they can be, many of them are much larger than the sun and the moon, but the key emphasis, I once had someone in this class that said it was like trying to be cynical about the Bible. It says, look at the Bible. They thought, because stars look like little points in heaven, they thought that they're small or something. Well, today stars can be 50 times the size of the sun, if not more than that. But, and trying to show his biblical knowledge. So I pointed out to him, you didn't read the entire verse. The verse continues and says, Shnei me'eres hagdolim l'hoyer ala aretz. The Bible is not giving you an astronomical picture of the solar system. It's not what the Bible comes to tell us. The Bible said these luminaries were created to bring light to this earth. The Bible is only concerned about the human beings on this earth. It's not discussing. The Bible is not a medical journal, nor is it a scientific manual, nor is it an astronomical map. It has astronomical information. But the Bible itself will say to you, if you need a healing, go to a doctor. There's an entire verse that says that if one needs healing, you go to a doctor. So to make that mistake that the Bible is here to replace the knowledge that we seek and we search for and we've discovered in science and medicine and so on is absolutely incorrect. As a matter of fact, from a biblical point of view, the same God who gave us a Torah was the same God that created laws of nature. And those laws of nature is what we study when we try to, through science, we try to discover what they are. And many of them we still have not uncovered. So if someone will say, was there in the Torah, does it talk about subatomic particles? Yeah, after the fact, you can find hints to it. But does it say it anywhere specifically? I haven't seen it. So in other words, there's that's critical. What the Torah concerns itself with, and this is key here, is to serve as a blueprint for life. When it tells us that the sun and the moon, or in this case the two great luminaries were created, it's only concerned with one thing, that those two luminaries give light to this earth. Whereas the stars, though we can see them in a distance, and though they may be much larger, but their impact on Earth is much weaker and doesn't have quite the same power. The sun, without the sun, we would not be alive for one moment. It regulates the temperature of this earth. It regulates the sea level. It regulates growth. It regulates vegetation. And above all, photosynthesis. It regulates oxygen. There's nothing on this earth that could survive without the sun. And precisely where the sun is placed, not closer and not more distant. So the whole cycle of the sun, even if it gets closer to Earth, or the angle, as I said, the equinox, bottom line is the sun never is too hot for this earth, and it's never too cold. And all the other regulators that the sun has. And it's many more than I just listed. But I listed were the obvious impact. When you talk about ultraviolet rays and the invisible rays of the sun, there would be no communication industry. Satellites would not function. We would not have cell phones. None of that would be able to exist if you did not have the sun's regulating how the waves flow because of the sun's power, which is quite itself an amazing thing, that this one body, the same sun that our forefathers and our ancestors and that Moses and Abraham saw in the skies, still shines and still affects us, and we still sunbathe in it, and we still are dazzled by it, and it still regulates Earth over all these years. That's itself something to make a blessing on. But more significantly, the Torah is concerned with l'hoyer ala aretz, that the sun is to illuminate this earth. And l'hoyer is an interesting word in Hebrew. The word ar has many meanings. Ar literally is translated often as light. But ar also means energy. It means power. It means warmth. In other words, that general word, when we say something is energy, as we all know, energy is a very broad word. Energy can include what kind of energy? You can have light as energy, so is sound energy. It's all energy. So energy has many, many levels, and that's the word used here, that the two great luminaries, l'hoyer, give energy to this earth. That's really the verse itself. And it's these two great luminaries, the sun and the moon. Now, we all know a lot has been said, much has been said about the moon, and much has been written, because the moon, as I said earlier, is much more obvious. Its cycles and its effect, and so on. The sun, as I said, is a once in 28-year discussion. But it's critical, if we want to understand both of them, especially the sun, it's critical to use the contrast, as I mentioned. So here's the big question. It's one thing that God put a sun and a moon in the heavens, as I said, to regulate life, to give energy to this world. And as I said, energy has many meanings, not just warmth, light, and oxygen, and all the other factors that that nourish us. But also energy means that the sun and the moon have something deeper to give us, something personal. Because there would have been many ways that a divine architect could have figured out how to regulate the life cycles, to regulate the waters, to regulate the temperature. The fact is, these two bodies could have been invisible for that matter. There are many forces that are invisible, including gravity, subatomic energy, nuclear energy, that is not visible to us. Here we have every morning a sunrise, every evening a sunset, every night another moon in its cycle, something to look at. It gives off light, in other words, visible to us. So here the mystics and the Hasidic masters explained to us that the Torah, as I mentioned, is a blueprint for life. That the sun and the moon are not just two luminaries that are in heaven, but as to use an expression, Sa'elam Nasan Belibam, which means a very, very actually eloquent concept, that each of us is a microcosm of everybody, of all of existence. In other words, life is like a hologram. All of us are a microcosm of everything. Or to use the Medrash expression of the Medrash, which means every human being is a small universe, a universe, a microcosm, and the universe is like a large organism. And this is used to explain our interaction and relationship with the environment. We are not just human beings that are traveling through an earth and a world and a universe as we see it. We are part and parcel of it, but above all, we are responsible for it. When you behave a certain way constructively, you elevate the entire universe with yourself. When, God forbid, a person does something destructive, it's not just destructive to yourself, in some way it impacts the macrocosm. So it's a microcosm-macrocosm relationship between us and the universe. You know, today, with all the talk about environment and humans destroying the nature and, as I said, the greening of America or the world, and beyond the cynicism, whether this is just another industry, some people trying to make money, some even suggest that the pharmaceutical industries are behind it all. But despite all of that, and I'm not questioning the validity of much of it, this is nothing new to anyone that's a Torah person. So it's true that some people criticize certain Jews for being insensitive to the environment or to health and so on. But the fact is, one of the 613 mitzvahs is you shall not destroy anything in this universe for no reason. Bal tashchis. Which doesn't just mean kill an animal. It also means everything mineral and vegetable as well. Because everything in this universe is part of one large organism, integral part, and we all are interdependent on each other. Not just humans and humans. All of the universe. Mineral, vegetable, animal, and human. One of the Rebbes, when he was a young child, and he was walking in the woods with his father, and he tore off a leaf from the tree, and he began rubbing it, and his father reprimanded him, "What right do you have to rip off a leaf from a tree for no reason?" And this became like a major lesson in his life. A leaf of a tree. How many of us are completely mindless in so many things that we do of that nature? This is called, because the universe is not just here for our indulgence, even if it didn't have an impact on the environment. It's a sacred universe. Someone put it here for purpose. So the sun, in that sense, is a sacred entity, as the moon is. Not sacred, I'm not talking about sun worshipping or moon worshipping now. I mean sacred as has a sanctity to it. And above all, it has a lesson to us. And even more than that, as I said, microcosm, macrocosm has to say that we have a sun within us and a moon within us. Or, if that sounds a little too weird, let's put it this way. We have lunar energy and we have solar energy. And these are two critical components in how a human being functions. And therefore, our obsession, you can say, or our to the detail of the lunar cycle and the solar cycle is not just about calculating when Rosh Chodesh is going to be and when the holiday will come in. That's the technical part of it. It's because we are concerned to understand the universe that's all within ourselves. And the fact that there are many, many things that we do not know that remain hidden from us and hidden from science that are critical to life, and we are unaware of it. But the sun and the moon, as the Torah says, Shnei Ma'eres Hagdelim, I planted two great luminaries in the heavens, L'hoyer ala Aretz, to illuminate the earth that you live on, is a message that besides the energy that it gives us for our personal physical lives and biological lives, it also teaches us something about ourselves. And therefore, when the sun celebrates its birthday, it's not just the sun's birthday, it's in a way our own birthday, the sun part of our lives' birthday. And when you begin to understand the sun in that context, in its psychological and spiritual, let's call it archetype, that was within our personalities, then the significance of the 28th, the 28th year of the end of the 28th year cycle is very significant. So then, what is the solar and lunar thing, and what is the significance of these 28 years? So let's begin with a very obvious question. You don't need to be a scientist to recognize the profound and amazing, literally beyond words, symmetry of nature. There are millions of examples, but one I just always remind myself, because I know someone used to come to this class, had a home. They used to go for the summers and early autumn in Montana. So Montana is considered to be the last natural wilderness in the United States. I say natural because there are a lot of unnatural wildernesses, including certain streets in Manhattan, I guess. But I mean to say, unnatural. We create so-called habitats. So it's hard to imagine walking the streets of New York City that once there was only trees and nature here and animals and this. Now it's pavement. And the pavement, once in a while, we give a little permission for a shrub or a tree to emerge from around the pavement. So everything is turned upside down. So she told me that one of the amazing things that she lives right at the edge of the wilderness, and there's a river there, a salmon river. Salmon, they spawn there, and the eagles, who love salmon, of course, it's important to mention, they perch in the cliffs, like above the river. They perch in the rocks. Thousands of eagles, thousands of them. It's not bald eagles; it's other type of eagle. And they wait to get the salmon. But this is the fascinating thing. So, as I say, one example. I'm sure you could bring up millions of them. They will not eat a salmon once after it's spawned and it dies. They will also not eat the salmon until it breeds, until it releases its eggs. Now we're talking about a 3-second span here, because the nature of the salmon, at least in this river, as they swim upstream, is that as soon as they lay their eggs, they die. And the eagle will not eat them after they die, they're dead, and will not eat them before they lay their eggs, for obvious reasons, because they have to guarantee their future meals. So it's not so selfless. Okay, so you have these thousands of eagles, she tells me. Suddenly, when the salmon, they all have this instinct, or they know exactly, in these 3 seconds, thousands of eagles swoop down, and they get their salmon. They don't get them all, but it's like an amazing sight, and then they go right back, as if it's like, if you missed it, you missed it. The whole thing takes maybe 10 seconds. So as I said, there are many, many examples. But this type of clockwork symmetry, and today we have cameras that are amazing what they were able to see and witness in the wild, under the water, nature shows. I'm always intrigued by this stuff, not just because of the symmetry, but it's also, I always find it really, as I said, a metaphor for so many things in our own lives. And many of our technologies are really just copying the nature in the first place. For instance, the most efficient way of use of space is building something in hexagons, like the catacomb of a bee. So you'll find, it's not necessarily comfortable to live on top of each other in a hexagon type of architectural structure, but the most efficient use of space was studied by studying bees, how they use the smallest amount of space for the maximum usage. Of course, the camera is a copy of our eye, and the airplane is a bird, etc., etc. So that when you have such symmetry, and as I said, beyond words, perfection. Just ask any pregnant woman when she begins to contract. Like on a clock. How does the body know? Literally, it'll be every 2 minutes. It'll be every 64 seconds. Literally on a clock, like a clock. Unless, God forbid, there's something wrong. But usually that's the way it is. So when you have such symmetry, the big question you have to ask ourselves, and we can ask this question about God, since you created such a perfect world, in nature, that is, until humans get into the picture, which we shall soon discuss, why is it that you made the cycle of the sun uneven? It should have been 365 years. I'm sorry, 365 days. Every year the sun returns to its exact place. There's so many things in nature, that's what happens. You know, you find that whether it's the march of the penguins or others, that animals will return exactly to the same place. They'll look for their family. I mean, there's this type of amazing awareness exists. So why create an unbalanced cycle of the sun, the moon, and so on? Let it be balanced, and fine. And they say Shalom al Yisrael is the expression. And we wouldn't have always be sitting here. And number one, we wouldn't have what to talk about every 28 years. That's true. And as well as other issues that this would solve. Now, this question I'm sure you haven't thought of, but this is a very legitimate question. And the answer is even more fascinating. It's precisely answered in that verse, L'hoyer ala aretz. But let me just emphasize that this same question is about the moon. The moon, too. Most of the complicated calculations made by Hillel in his time, and they are complicated, in the cycles of the sun and the moon, but still amaze researchers today. In the reconciliation of the moon and the sun cycle, I discussed last week about the leap year, that every 19 years there are 7 leap years in the Hebrew calendar in order to reconcile the 11.5-day deficit between a lunar year and a solar year. A lunar year is like, because the lunar cycle, as I mentioned, is 29, 30 days. So all these discrepancies could have been resolved if everything just had its uniform, balanced cycle. And nature is full of it. Why suddenly, when it comes to this cycle, which should be the biggest question when we stand Wednesday morning and look up at the sun, so it's very nice to celebrate the sun, but you could ask the questions to the sun, like why, in heaven's name, what, you just create a balanced thing, and then that would be much simpler to resolve. And the answer lies in the verse that says, that I just described, because the sun and moon were created to illuminate, to give energy to this world, to us. And in a strange and mysterious symbiosis, the sun and moon reflect our own inconsistencies and discrepancies. So if the sun had its perfect cycle and the moon had its perfect cycle, yeah, it'd be very nice naturally, but they could not be claimed to be two lords or two celestial bodies that relate to us on earth. They would be like too perfect. We don't work that way. And this brings us to the discussion of our own inner harmony as opposed to our, it's called imbalance of our lives. So the sun's being off and not being perfect as it goes through its cycle is a reflection of our own imperfections. And there is built into nature, into the sun and the moon, that type of connection. As I said, it's a microcosm, macrocosm. And the interesting thing is we also have the power to correct the discrepancy. So when we celebrate every 28 years, what we're doing is recognizing that there's something off, but we're also recognizing there's a point where it comes back to its original point. So to speak about it in psychological and personal terms, what this simply means is this. When we were born, we were, and in most cases, where God blesses and most children are born healthy. I'm not discussing now a situation, God forbid, that's otherwise. What is health? Health is essentially a perfect, balanced organism functioning. You look at a newborn child, you see perfect symmetry. You see the breathing. You literally can see the chest heave up and down. The flow is all there. I just was busy witnessing this when my grandchild was born a few months ago. I look forward to see her soon, coming from California for Passover. So besides being my grandchild, I also witnessed, I wanted to observe this firsthand, what I once looked like, type of thing. We all are looking for a paradise lost. Revisit the moment that before we lost our innocence. So when she gets older, I'll tell her that I used her as I didn't abuse her, God forbid, but I definitely studied the whole system. And what I see was that what we all are, we all began this freshly fallen snow in a world, and then of course the toxins begin to accumulate. And you almost feel sad, I was looking at my granddaughter and I'm looking at her, and I'm sorry, I'm saying this is just, anyone can look at any newborn child and you can feel the same thing. It's a certain sadness. Does she know what kind of world she came to? So emotionally, for sure, she doesn't know yet. Psychologically, but even on a physical level, now she's starting to breathe what we all breathe. No longer the breath from heaven or the breath from the womb, and no longer surrounded by the protective embryonic fluids. Now we're in a harsh world, and germs, and this and that. Yes, of course, we build up immunity and so on. But it's an interesting study, and most importantly, it's each of us. We all went on this journey. So to understand life in that context, that we began in a pure place, and I'm not even getting now into human errors and sins, so to speak, just living in this world with even no mistakes, losing that innocence, entering into a world that is far from perfect, and then where are we left? So the first and most important message that Judaism teaches, and this may be the first lesson of all, when we stand and watch and bless the sun, is that all is not lost. Just because we are no longer as pure, as innocent, as seamless, as honest as we were when we were newborn children, this does not mean that that the rest is history, and you never can return there. Yes, you may not be able to return to the naive, pure sense of what a child is all about, but the mission of our lives is to return and to correct the aberrations. And that's exactly what we do every 28 years with the sun. Yes, the sun is off a bit, and it's off because we're off, as we shall soon discuss. But that doesn't mean it ends there. There comes a point, and when it comes that point, you never forget it. It's like going back to the moment when it was balanced. So does that mean we achieve complete balance? Well, that's our goal. But if you don't celebrate balance in your life, and you say, I screwed up already, that's it, then you will never find salvation. So, for instance, in distinguishing, just for contrast purposes, between the Jewish perspective on sin and, let's say, the Christian perspective. So the Christians, in what I believe is an aberration of how they read the Bible, perhaps not fully understanding Hebrew or whatever it was, or maybe it was intentional by some of the original Jews to make sure there's a distinction between the two. But their understanding of original sin is so foreign to Jewish thinking, literally like life and death. And unfortunately, it has even affected Jewish thinking till this day. And I'll explain in a moment what I mean. Original sin, the concept of original sin, is that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, which means they defied God's command not to eat from it, and they tasted of the tree of good and evil. They tasted of evil, basically. And just for another myth is that it was an apple, an Adam's apple. Not correct. According to the Torah, there are 4 opinions, but none of them are an apple. Anybody knows? One opinion is that it was a grain, chita. One opinion is an esrog, a citron. And a third opinion, a fig. And the fourth opinion, grapes. But no one considers it to be an apple. I have a theory. There's a taste for somewhere in the Talmud that says kimin tapuach, like an apple, which means like a citron, really. But nowhere, the forbidden fruit was not an apple. That's not relevant to our discussion, but I just wanted to mention it. So this concept of original sin is that when they did that, everything changed. Fine. But it went further than that. No longer can we achieve perfection, which leads to the concept in that religion that the only way to find salvation is to believe in a certain Jew. Not you, Matthew, but you know what I'm referring to. As Shlomo Kabach would say, Brother JC, right? So which itself is if you're a Jewish, makes you laugh, exactly. You turn the Jew into a god. But the point being is that we are doomed on this earth. Now, there are variations in Christian theology of how doomed, but basically this is a principle that goes through most of Christian denominations. I'm not here to knock it or not, it's just by contrast. From a Jewish perspective, that's absolutely incorrect. Yes, there was a grave sin, and we'll discuss it. It is similar to the loss of innocence of a child when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. However, the concept of original sin, capital O, is non-existent. Just as the concept of a devil that controls earth is non-existent. And just like the concept that evil is not more powerful than good, and the only way to redeem yourself is to believe in a Jew. From a Jewish perspective, the whole point of human responsibility and the dignity of the human being is that you are not off the hook just because you made a mistake. That you have the power of tshuva, which is return. By the way, not repentance. Return means what? Returning to something that you were once originally there. That's what tshuva means. When you repent, which is often how people translate tshuva, repentance means leaving something behind. You sinned, you leave the sin behind. Judaism calls it tshuva. Return. Returning to what exactly? If you made a mistake, what are you returning to? Yeah, you regret the mistake, but you return to the place that was prior to the mistake. In other words, there's a part of the soul that is never touched by any mistake, and you return to that. The only problem is that the arteries have been blocked, so to speak. In other words, the soul of a human being and the divinity of existence and the goodness of this universe can be concealed, but it's never annihilated. It may be very deeply concealed. It's never annihilated. So the concept of reparation, of return, of being able to fix that which was broken, tikkun olam, is fundamental to Jewish thought, not because we're perfect, but because we have the ability to achieve something that's better than perfection, and that's to fix something that's broken. That's more profound and higher than a person that's perfect. That's why you say a Baal Tshuva reaches a place that a tzaddik can never reach. Because someone that's never fallen, never made a mistake, if there is such a thing on this earth, that's someone that lives in the light. They've never seen anything else. What's the greatest achievement of all is to be able to go through an aberration, to go through a discrepancy, to make a mistake and correct it. The Talmud just qualifies it, just in case anyone's getting any smart ideas. The Talmud says, Echtev Oshev, if someone says, I'm going to sin and then do tshuva, that won't be acceptable. Because, of course, you have to cover every loophole. Someone will say, oh, that's so great, okay. So I'm going to live 20, 30 years in just indulging. And then, the greatest thing of all, I'll transform it all to light. No, that doesn't work that way. It means if you made a real mistake, even if it was an intentional mistake, but not with a plan to have it all worked out, that here, half your life you have fun, and the other half of your life you correct it all. Nothing wrong with having fun. I'm talking about unhealthy type. So the idea that we celebrate the cycle of the sun, going back to its original place, is essentially the idea of celebrating that no matter what happened in these 28 years, and no matter what discrepancies and no matter how imbalanced things are, you can retrieve the balance, you can access it, and you can revisit it and draw it back down into your life. So when we stand on Wednesday morning and make the blessing, Baruch Eisem Ma'aseh Bereishis, which means we bless God, the one who reenacts the acts of creation, or the Eisem Ma'aseh Bereishis, the one who creates. What are we really saying? The words can be very, very cryptic, or not cryptic. Back to the mechanical. Okay, yeah, you thank God He created the sun. Very nice. But what relevance does it have to us? So yes, okay, you're thanking God for creating a sun that regulates life, giving us regulates temperature, regulates, as I said, all the different things that we would not. There's no question. A blessing has a simple mitzvah of called saying thank you. Just like before you eat a piece of meat, a piece of food, you make a blessing. You're saying thank you. So that obvious pshat level, literal meaning of a blessing is obvious. But to understand the significance of the 28 years, the cycle, and why we say it, you could say that blessing every day of your life. Every day we need a sun. Every moment we need the sun. Even, by the way, when the sun is not shining, it still affects Earth. Even the night, even the places where it's dark at night. So what we're really saying is, besides the blessing, Baruch in Hebrew, When we say Baruch Atah, we also, Baruch comes from the word like grafting or channeling, drawing. It's drawing down the birthday energy of the sun, saying that we can go back to the place of the sun before it shined on a world that became damaged. Imagine, I'll tell you a story that happened a few years ago with me, a Holocaust survivor who I met. I actually gave a talk. It was in, where was it? He lived in London. It wasn't in London. It was in the United States somewhere. Anyway, I think Florida. I gave a talk. I talked about darkness and finding light through darkness. And I mentioned the Talmud, the interesting Talmudic story, that when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden, it was Friday. And Wednesday was the birth of the sun. Adam and Eve, birth of the human race, was Friday. And that Friday night, it says the sun never set. The first Shabbos of the universe was 36 hours of light. Friday, the night, and then Shabbos day, and the sun began setting Saturday night for the first time. Lamed Vav Shas, it says, Shim Sha'era. 36 hours was light. So that Shabbos was a Shabbos of light, a pure world. And then it says Saturday night, as the sun began to set, Adam and Eve began to tremble. They were terrified because they never saw night before. Imagine the first time you see night. And they thought they had destroyed the universe because they had eaten from the tree of knowledge. And it got darker and darker. They thought as it got completely dark, was going to be death. And they couldn't go to sleep because they were so disturbed that they had destroyed the earth that was given to them. And they stayed up all night, it says, praying and doing tshuva and whatever it takes. And then, of course, as the dawn broke and the sun started rising, they realized, as the Talmud says, they realized that this was not due to them, it's due to the natural cycle of the sunrise and the sunset, which they were not aware of. So there's two ways you could actually interpret the Torah. That their relief was a good thing, they knew they didn't destroy the universe. Or, as some would say, maybe it was the other way around. At least here they were sensitized to the fact that maybe they did, and now they say, it's not us, it turns night every night. Imagine if we really were able to be sensitive enough and think that it turns dark in the world every time you make a mistake. That would be, I'm not talking about put guilt on us, I mean just the idea of being sensitive, that your actions do make a difference. It's not like things are going to go on either way, no matter whether I better or worse. So however you interpret the Talmud, I shared this story. And I said that sometimes people go through dark times in their lives and they feel hopeless. So we know the sunrise can awaken us to the fact that there's a new morning, a new day, a new dawn breaks. And I had no clue who was in the audience when I shared this. And a guy came over to me, an elderly gentleman, and I was mortified by what he told me. I mean, mortified in I don't know if it's a positive way, a negative way, but it was like so uncanny. He says to me, I can't believe, how do you know what to say this Shabbos? So I said, I shared a thought. I don't know, how do I know? I think God puts maybe the right words in your mouth. He said to me, and he was like, he said, I was in Auschwitz, and my darkness came when they took my mother, and then they took my father, and they took my siblings, and everyone. And I miraculously survived. And I remember, he said, lying in those bunkers. He said, 1,000 of us on top of each other, lice infested, like dehumanized. And he says, I would wake up sometimes. I guess he was a young teenager, he said. And I'd wake up sometimes, pure exhaustion. You only fell asleep when you were exhausted because it was impossible. Stench and everything. I'm sharing it the way he said it to me, so I hope I don't disturb anybody's sensibilities. But, when people like that talk, how disturbed we may be, they were more disturbed, let's put it that way. And he said to me, and I woke up, I used to wake up, I'd fall asleep in exhaustion. Sometimes I'd wake up, and for a moment I didn't remember where I was. You go to sleep. Sleep takes you somewhere else. And I woke up and I said, I would have where I lay in my bunk, my, can't even call it a bed, I guess, whatever it was that, I would see the light of the sun seeping through the window. and the Carpathian Mountains, which were visible from the camp in the distance, and sometimes it was a very blue sky. And for a minute or two, I thought I was like in a, I was in a very healthy place. You know, sun shining, the sky is blue, birds, and then suddenly I realized where I was. And I became obsessed, he said. I became so angry at the sun, and at the sky, and at the birds, and at the mountains, and at God, of course. How could they be so silent? The fact that I could even delude myself into thinking that it's beautiful. How could a sun shine on this earth when it sees what's going on here? How could the birds chirp, and how could the mountains be themselves, and so on? Now, people who've gone through serious traumatic experiences know that you get fixated sometimes on objects that are around you. And his anger, everything was let out. So it's not so rational, if you may think is that. It was like a profound anger. That's what he looked at the world that he was able to see through the eyes of a young teenager, innocent teenager, and got angry. Contrast. And he said, when I finally got out of the camps, that anger never went away from me, because I could not tolerate the fact that there was this indifference, and nature was indifferent. And he was a Torah verse person, because I saw, he says, yeah, Moses said, Hazinu Hashamayim v'sishma orz imrefi. Moses said before he passed away, may the heaven and earth be witnesses to what I say now, because the heaven and earth will always be here. He says, yeah, but the heaven and earth were witnesses maybe to what he said. But what happened when they were witnesses to what happened to us? I mean, he went on and on. He was giving, he wasn't releasing them. He was just sharing with me. He said, I got out of that godforsaken place, just completely devastated. I had no interest in living. I was guilty that I remained alive and my family was not alive any longer. I went to Paris, finally ended up in London, and just a broken man. He was a broken teenager, basically. And literally for years, I remained locked in my house, isolated myself, and didn't really know where it's going to happen. And one morning, I woke up, and again it was dawnbreak, and the same sun that came through the window, that in Auschwitz, the same sun came through the window in London. And for some reason, he said, I think it was 1953 when this happened, 54. That same sun gave me hope again. Because I said, if a sun can still shine after what happened, there's hope. And he started rebuilding his life. And then he says, you come here today. This was a Shabbos, I remember. It was a Shabbos afternoon. And you tell the story about Adam and Eve, and it's my story. I also stayed up all night. For me, the night didn't end, however. And for me, the sun was an enemy for years. And now the sun is what gave me hope again. So, when you think of it in those terms, and this is a person talking from his heart and his soul, after what he went through, it would be interesting for me to contact him. I could even find out where he is, what he thinks about this 28th cycle, because he was there too, when it was not in its, as I said, 1953 actually was the year of the blessing. Before that was 1925. So when the sun was shining on Auschwitz and on Buchenwald and on other death camps, and when 1.5 million Jewish children, innocent children, as I said, innocent, no sin, nothing, went up in smoke, so that sun is a sun that witnessed the worst. Yet, as Jews, we know that it's not the end of the story. So when we make a blessing every 28 years on the sun, we're saying we're going back to the sun the way it was born before the world became so cruel. Because back then, that Wednesday morning, before Adam and Eve were even on earth, it was a pure world. It was a world of paradise. And it's not something nostalgic we just go back to remember the past. We recreate that past. And that's what we hold on to. So the significance of the 28 of the end of the cycle is not just, as I said, some nice commemorative thing, a rare occurrence. It's all nice and good. It's about actually reconnecting to that solar energy. So to just sum up what I said till now is this, that on one end, the discrepancy of the calculations that the solar cycle is not perfect is an exact duplicate of our lives. We are also not perfect. So we can identify with that. And the fact that the sun returns to its original place, point of origin, tells us the second message, that we too can return to our point of origin. Yeah, we may not be able to turn back the clock to what we were like when we were newborn children, but we can recreate that energy. Because remember, every birthday that we celebrate is a birthday. It's your birthday. It's when your soul entered this earth. And I can tell you from my own humble experiences, and collectively the Jews as a whole can bear witness to this, we have, at the brink of extinction, rediscovered ourselves and found a renaissance. I was just talking to someone who called me from Israel today, just went through a horrible divorce, and he regrets it all because he just discovered that his wife of over 30 years is suffered from sexual abuse. And he was asking me whether there's hope. He realizes his own selfishness or his own behavior, if there's hope. And there's no question that there's hope. Because people who suffered greatly, even if it seems like that things get really dark, but as I gave him the analogy, it's like a flower. When a flower begins to bud, begins to grow, so then slowly, its petals begin to open up. What happens if that flower is hurt? It will close up, and sometimes it will not open so fast. It may take years and years. But it's God's way of helping the flower protect itself, that the day comes when it can open again, it will open. This is fundamental to Jewish thought. That even when someone is deeply hurt, and even if they go into all kinds of machinations and complex defense mechanisms to protect themselves, it's precisely that, to protect. It doesn't mean that it's damaged goods and there's no way to reverse the process. It means, in a strange way, God has methods that we learn to protect ourselves in sometimes bizarre ways due to bizarre events. But the day comes when that soul can emerge again. Now, if everyone believed in this, obviously we'd have a different world. Many people don't believe it. They don't believe it themselves. Well, that's why I am here, and that's what I was taught. And that's why we celebrate the sun. The sun reminds us that you could be there just like I was there. I also saw horrible things. But I also came from a place 206 times 28 years ago, 206 cycles of 28 years. That was a very pure place. And I've seen both sides. And I'm here with you, and you are here with me, and we celebrate together. So we're not talking about looking for perfection. We're talking about finding harmony in a place that's not so perfect. That's the story of the two Ma'iris Hagdelim, the two luminaries of the sun and the moon. Now, this is not so much a discussion of the moon, but I should mention, and some of you may be familiar with a very both cryptic, but at the same time extremely powerful Talmudic story. And the story goes that when God created these two big luminaries, which will be, as I said, next Wednesday morning will be exactly the way that was then, an interesting episode takes place, a dialogue between of all the moon and God. So it says, God created Shnei Ma'iris Hagdelim. And the moon comes, what they call the Kitrug Halavana. The moon comes with a complaint, with a accusation, you can say. Different ways to explain it. Kitrug is also so it comes with a complaint. The complaint is this, a logical complaint. You call us both Shnei Ma'iris Hagdelim, these two great luminaries. Yes, the verse afterwards says Hamoyer Hagadol, the great one, Hamoyer HaKatan, the smaller one. But they both begin Shnei Ma'iris Hagdelim, which is where the Talmud derives its story from. Which one is it? First it says two great luminaries, then it says one is great, a Gadol, and one is Katan. So the dialogue goes like this. The moon says to the god, it's impossible for two kings to have one crown. You created two giants here, two great luminaries. So God responds in very harsh terms, which initially can be even almost sound like a punishment, but the Shalah explains it's not a punishment, but more of a tikkun, a piece of advice, a wise piece of advice. God says to the moon, oh, that's what's bothering you? So l'chi umati esatzmacha. Go ahead and diminish yourself, so we won't have this problem. And that's what happens. that's when the moon becomes Moyer HaKatan. It gets diminished. And the moon no longer has the same power as the sun. It reflects the sun, or even if it would have reflected before, it would have been equal power. There's many ways they explain it. But then it continues on, and the moon continues, doesn't stop. You think it should stop at this point. And the moon says, I said something appropriate. I gave you a logical thing, and you turned me into told me to go diminish myself. So God begins a long, elaborate, so-called snatzlus, elaborate disclaimers or correction. God says the Jews will count by your cycle. The moon is not satisfied with that. God says you will look like my great people, like Jacob, who was called Hakatan, the smaller one. Esau was the older one. Jacob is Hakatan, like the Mar Hakatan. Like David, the Katan, David, the humble one. You'll be a symbol of humility. And the Talmud goes on with a whole bunch of other things, explaining how the moon will have its day as well. This Talmud becomes the target of some most elaborate discussions in Kabbalistic thought. The entire book's actually dedicated just to understand this Talmud. Besides the fact, for the obvious questions, what was the moon complaining about? God created them both. What was the problem? What was the problem? And what is this thing about diminishing yourself? And I forgot, of course, to mention the end of it, the end of the Talmud, which is, in a way, maybe the most mysterious part of it. God then says, I will then give the Jewish people a Rosh Chodesh, a new moon, the new month of the new moon, and they will bring a chatas, they will bring a korban chatas, a particular offering that forgives on sins. But listen to this. This is the only place it says in the Torah, chatas la'Hashem. They will forgive my sin, God says, for diminishing you. A kapara on the fact that you were diminished because of me. So all these books, as I was saying, what is going on here? If the moon was right, then why did God cause it to diminish? If the God is right, why does God need a kapara, a tikkun, a healing? So as I said, this is not the place to go into the details because we don't want to embarrass the sun. This is not a discussion about the moon, it's about the sun. But I just wanted to touch upon it because there are a few points that are very relevant here. Generally speaking, briefly, what was going on here, as the Kabbalists explain, the moon and the sun are two parts within ourselves. The sun is the solar energy within us, which is called the mashpia. Mashpia means the one that, when we are in a state of giving. There are times that we are in a state of transmitting. And then there's another part of us when we have to be in a state of receiving, makabel, a state of absorption. And both are necessary. Now you may think that a state of transmission is more powerful than the state of absorbing. That's not correct. Absorbing is more powerful than to transmit. As a matter of fact, it's only those that absorb well that can transmit well. Think of it in education. If you haven't listened well, if you haven't studied well, if you have not retained knowledge, you'll never be able to really convey knowledge. So these two so-called features, these two necessary elements in each personality, the solar and the lunar, have a balance. And the discussion of the moon with God, the dialogue, was all about this balance. Where the moon, in its logic, could not understand how there could be both of them to be dominant. The moon understood that the most dominant force would be to receive. And the moon was right, but the moon was not right in the sense that you just receive without being given something. In other words, the sun is necessary because the sun transmits, and if you don't have the teacher, you can't have the student to become a teacher. And when God said, diminish yourself, it wasn't a curse or a punishment. It was saying, you want to really achieve the power of absorbing well, you have to first have a little bittul. You have to diminish yourself. And when you diminish yourself, you will become great. And therefore, at the end of the story, when God says, Heviya like kapara, bring me a kapara, correct, I need to be forgiven for what I have achieved, is because as a result of the bittul of the moon diminishing itself, comes all the problems of life. And that's what God wanted forgiveness. So it's true in the balance of the world, which goes back to what I discussed earlier, the discrepancy. Why does the sun and the moon have to be discrepant? Why does the moon have to have a diminishing nature? Why couldn't the sun just be a powerful light? Because we live in a world that's not perfect. So in a sense, our imperfection is imposed upon the two luminaries. And that's the way God placed it. However, God regrets on one end, because as a result of that, the purpose of it all was to challenge us to rise to the occasion. In other words, when you're living in a perfect environment, there's nothing achieved. By concealing the divine presence, which is the ultimate tzimtzum harishin, the ultimate tzimtzum, the ultimate diminishing, allowed an environment where we have the independent choice to achieve something. So think of it as an example. Think of a parent hiding from a child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to find that parent. But then the child stops looking, because the parent is so good at hiding himself or herself that the child has given up. What happens next can be tragic. What happens next is the child goes off and creates its own agenda in life, forgets that it has something to search for, and that's the world in which we live. When newborn children have a seamless connection, as I said, to their source, as all of us did at our birth, as the sun did at its birth. But then when you enter this world, there is a concealment, a fundamental concealment between, you can say, between the soul and the body, between the spirituality of our lives and our material existence. A discrepancy. There's a disparity, perhaps a better word. A disparity between who you are and what you do, between your higher calling and mission and what you got yourself involved in. Most people are not involved in necessarily what their purpose of existence is. Most of our days and nights are occupied with the means. What the end is, some of us may think we know, some of us don't know, some of us know that they don't know. But one thing is for sure, even those that know, it's very elusive. It's very difficult to hold on to the higher purpose, because life has so many demands. We have so much pain. We have challenges. We have all the challenges and issues I described earlier, psychological and emotional ones, the wounds and scars we carry. It's almost impossible to imagine how can you hold on to something higher in this world. So we are all in that type of place. We've all become diminished. Now, the original purpose of the diminishing was simply the concealment, was that we should be wise enough to overcome it and understand. But what happens if we didn't? The consequences can be, as I said, devastating. The consequences is the story of history. The story of history is of a human race that forgot its purpose, that wandered away from its calling. It all began as a challenge, which is very good and nice on paper. But once it becomes a true wandering away, people destroy each other. God says, for that I need forgiveness, because the diminishing was necessary for the bittul, but the consequence that came out of it, that people could do what they could to each other, that I want you on Rosh Chodesh to repair. Now, when you read this whole Talmudic story, and I'm being brief because of time and other reasons, it's not so much the focus. It almost seems like a dialogue between the moon and God, and the sun is like not relevant here. But it's not the case at all. As I discussed earlier, the sun and the moon are in a very symbiotic relationship. They affect each other all the time. The sun too was affected by the moon's words, and it too fell into a state of disparity. As I said, the cycle is not perfect. So whether it's solar energy or it's lunar energy, they both are shining on a world that's not perfect, and as a result, they are not perfect. But here is where the human being comes into play, that we have the power to reconnect it all. We have the power to revisit and reconnect it to its point of origin, which is really what the power of next Wednesday morning is all about. And the connection to Passover, just briefly, is I think pretty obvious also. Passover is the celebration of the freedom, but it's really a celebration. How one achieves freedom is through bittul, is through humility. Matzah is called the bread of humility. So it's not an accident that the blessing on the sun happens always around Passover time, and this year actually right leading into Passover. So as we stand on the Wednesday morning, before we burn the chametz, and we make a blessing on the sun, we're essentially reconnecting to something that has been reconnected to only 206 times in our history, and only 11 times on the day before Pesach. But reconnecting to our sun as it was before everything took place. And reconnecting and saying we can draw it down. And then we go and burn the ego of the chametz, and then we lead into the Passover Seder. If you think about it, and I'm sure everyone here can develop this further, these are the main points, you have here a fascinating and a powerful model for real growth, and one that doesn't come very often. The next time, you can do the math yourself, you'll be 28 years older. Is that right, accurate? Okay. Where will I be then? Oh, okay. Hopefully I'll see you all, and we'll celebrate, and maybe there'll be another generation here as well. But we should all have many healthy, good years from here till there, and above all, to take this message and this lesson called the solar energy, and remember that the sun needs us and we need the sun, as well as the moon, and vice versa. The moon will be full Wednesday night and Wednesday. The sun will be full in the sense that it's going back to its original place. These two energy forces are here to lahayr ala aretz, to energize this world, to give us strength. So if this is not an opportunity for a rebirth and a renewal, what is? With Passover thrown into it. So I want to extend my blessing to everyone here, not just for a very good Passover and a transcendental and redemptive Passover, but also being that it's a special year, this 28-year cycle, that we can, I address some key points, but you can find layers and layers of ways that you can meditate and apply the powerful message of the sun in our lives, particularly in the area of our own inner harmony and peace. And access this day, which, as I said earlier, time is like a spiral. Something actually will happen that morning, whether you see it or not, or you feel it or not. You know, what do we feel after all anyway? And see. But we're told that it has such power. And if you can use it as to catapult you, and I'm saying it as a blessing, we will use it to catapult us, as a springboard into a new future. And whatever has happened in your past, whether you had difficulty in finding your soulmate, I don't know if anybody has that issue in New York, but some I know once in a while do. Or you found your soulmate but don't know how to hold on and appreciate it. Or it's in other areas of whether it's health or parnasa, livelihood, or above all maybe the inner peace that every one of us needs. Without that, how much else can really work well? So here's a real opportunity, and may this day, this special day, give everybody that strength. And sometimes, as they say in the Talmud, in the Tanakh, there was an incident where they entered into a certain environment, a group of people, and a shudder came over them. And they said, "What was the shudder?" They said, "Well, something was going on." Even though they didn't see it or feel it, but their mazel, their inner spirit felt it. So sometimes you come into an environment where you may not see anything, you may not even sense it, but something happens to you, it affects you. Because you don't see it, but your soul senses it. A part of your soul senses it. So next Wednesday morning, if you allow yourself and just cut away some of the clutter, some of the turbulence, some of the disparities in our life, and align ourselves to this cycle of the sun in the heavens and the sun within each of us, you may, not a shudder, but maybe a very deep harmony, tranquility may enter into you. And of course the big challenge will be to hold on to it. So maybe Passover is a perfect transition, straight from the sun to the moon and to Pesach. So everyone have a very powerful holiday. I want to reiterate again what I've said. If anybody is interested or needs to have a place to go to a Seder that's meaningful, that maybe can welcome you, or an environment of real tranquil, spiritually tranquil environment, you could please speak to me or to Velvel. But I'm here, and we'll try to help you out wherever you may be. I can even invite you to where I'll be doing the Seder, depending on your circumstances. So I want to share that. And finally, we will not, we have to always make technical announcements. So there will not be a class next Wednesday night, at least not physically. Spiritually, I'm sure we shall be together one way or another. Right. This room here. And the same as next 2 Wednesdays, because the following Wednesday is still the holiday. The holiday actually ends, I believe, Wednesday night, right? Okay, so if you want more details, just for the record, of everything that goes on here, events and programs that will be going on the next 3 months, it's all updated literally daily at our website, meaningfullife.com. So there's a calendar there, has all the details there. So tomorrow night, Philip will be giving his class, as my son, and they will be going further into some of these topics about the solar dimension of things. So that's 7 o'clock in the evening is for Philip, and my son is at 9 o'clock, Mendel. And beyond that, if you haven't left your email address, please do so. And finally, again, I want to wish everyone a new beginning, and I send my best regards to the son wherever you are, and I'll do the same wherever I am. Everyone have a very good evening. Thank you so much.